Hello and welcome back to Modern World History. In this video, we're gonna continue looking at the interwar period. But in the last video, we were talking about how the United States was just kind of booming during the 1920s. We also talked about some of the disillusionment that existed between Europeans and how people had started to doubt democracy and doubt everything they'd ever understood about Enlightenment ideas and progress and reform and all these different things. And so we're on the cusp of the Great Depression, which is in the United States going to start in 1929. But really, if you look at the whole picture here, you can understand that this is not just a United States issue. So so let's break it down. First of all, when I say global in scale, that's what we mean. It's global in scale. After World War One, there were many problems. Okay, uh, there were many problems. Europe was wrecked. The United States offered loans, but Europeans still struggled. Now we mentioned this earlier in the last video, but just kind of expanding on this a little bit. The United States was giving loans to the war-torn European countries, but they had a hard time paying the loans back, and also the Germans were solely blamed for the war due to Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, and so they would have to pay the reparations, and they couldn't get any traction as well. So there was a lot of difficulty there. People began to doubt the strength of democracy. Many new democracies lacked experience. There were too many political parties and too many different ways of thinking in Europe. I mean, in the United States, we have two political parties, really. I mean, and we might have some different variation within those parties, like people who are further left or further right, and people who are considered mostly kind of moderate, which means they adopt some of the ideals of both sides. But in Europe, you've got different parties that represent almost like special interests, and so it's very challenging sometimes for these political parties. And there's also going to be too many government changes. All right, so all these things kind of add to the mix here as what's going on in Europe after World War One. So if you look at Germany's Weimar Republic, which is the republic, the Republican democracy that existed after the Germany fell, um, there's going to be some serious flaws here. One, people are used to dictatorship here. They don't know what to do with democracy, and also their economy is wrecked. If you look here at the inflation issues, this kid is literally stacking stacks of money as though they are stacking blocks. And what the government did to respond to this is they just kept printing money. So you can look at history and you can see people like the Romans, for example, that would put crap metal inside their coins and put more of it out in the market, and you can see the inflation would emerge, and yet people don't pick up on this. But the more of something there is, the less value it's going to have. And so as the government just continued to print money, the money became ubiquitous, and it was extremely devalued to the point that you'd have to have a whole buggy full of cash in order to even come out with a loaf of bread. It was just completely worthless. And so this one here was how Germany was looking. People also blamed the Weimar Republic for Germany's losing World War One. Some of the people that had called some of the shots during the war would become some of the Republican leaders there. And so, really, generally speaking, people thought that the peace agreements and things like that were too weak, and that Germany was too quick to, I guess, allow all of the blame to be on the shoulders of German people. So people had kind of already lost faith in that government even before it got started good. The Dawes Plan was a plan for a $2 million loan from the United States to help with reparations, to help Germany with reparations, and it was designed to help stabilize the German economy. Because if the Germans are better off, they'll be more likely to be able to pay back reparations, and loans and everything like that would be able to get paid back as well, and everyone would benefit. And so that did, in fact, help to stabilize Germany's economy. Meanwhile, in the political scene, you also have the Kellogg-Brian Act. Germany's Gustav Stresemann met with France's Aristide Briand, and the two guys made a pact. They made a peace agreement. Now, if you remember, just from a few videos ago in the previous unit, we're talking about how Bismarck and Napoleon III of France, they had a fallout, and that really had never healed itself between the two groups, and they were always fighting over the territories between the two countries. And so this here was a big deal. When Germany and France are going to make peace, this is a big deal. Germany was now admitted into the League of Nations, and every country in the world signed the KelloggBrian Peace Pact. And so what this was it was a agreement that no one's going to allow war to be an instrument of national policy. So they're going to figure out how to handle their issues in a more humane and I guess more practical way than fighting and killing, since World War I was so destructive. But oops, League of Nations. We forgot we had no armed forces to enforce the lasting peace. Not really an official quote, but you'll get the picture in a few videos. The United States economy also was not as strong as it seemed even during the 1920s, when it seemed like everyone was doing really well. There was a very uneven distribution of wealth. Now, this is also kind of playing itself out in the world of news today, where we're talking about the increasingly uneven distribution of the wealthiest of the wealthy. But during this period, 5% of people in the country received 33% of U.S. personal income. So this means 5 out of 100 people were getting a third of all money made in the country. 60%, so almost 2/3 of the population of the United States made less than $2,000 a year. So that is a gross inequality of income distribution. So if you've got that many people who are living on the brink of poverty, and only a few people who are who have enough economic capacity to afford the luxuries of life, and even some of the things we might take for granted, like education that can lead to better careers, then you're going to start seeing where people don't have enough money to spend. So let's talk about that for a second. Whenever you hear about tax cuts and things like this, the reason why people will do those and give out tax cuts is because the expectation is if people get an extra, I don't know, $2,000, they're going to go out and spend it on things like TVs or car loans or things like this. They're going to buy something with it. So if a president, like let's say President Trump, does another tax cut, and which he's talked about and he's untalked about and all this, but if he goes in and does this, and then everyone just uses it to pay down loans or saves it, it's not going to have any effect. So he expects people to spend money, which is going to stimulate the economy, and everyone's going to benefit. All right. So if you look at that, and then you look at the idea that so many people can't really afford to buy anything, retail is going to start cutting back on purchasing supplies from factories because they can't sell anything. No one has enough money to spend. And also, if you look over here real quick, just make a quick note, in agriculture, there was a lot of overproduction as well as competition from other markets in other countries as globalization takes hold. We already talked a little bit about how Egypt and India were also making cotton, for example, and so the United States wasn't the only place to get these things. And so prices were low, and there were virtually no profits, and many farmers defaulted on the loans that they had in order to start farming in the first place. And so they were losing their farms essentially, and also still not making any money. It's very similar to what we see today in agriculture, I might add. So factories stopped producing. We're right here. Factories stopped producing goods, which means they laid off more workers, which means there were less retail, which means there were even less production. And you can see that the cycle didn't only not stop, but started to increase very quickly. And before you know it, in 1929, on Black Friday, the stock market is going to crash, and stocks are going to lose all value. Factories are going to close. Unemployment is going to immediately skyrocket, and people that were living high on the hog suddenly have nothing, and there's nothing they can do about it. And so the depression is going to affect the world. It's global in scale. It doesn't just affect the United States. You can see here on this map, I'm probably going to let you guys take the time to look at that more closely on your own. But you can see here that the percentage of state population receiving unemployment benefits in 1934 were pretty high. You also see that the areas in the red squares in some of these big cities or whatnot are going to be places where there's going to be civil unrest or disobedience due to all this. And you can also see globally the percentage of the workforce that was unemployed in some of the places we're about to talk about. So I'll let you guys kind of look over that on your own and take that in. And I'm going to keep on trucking. All right, so the United States demand for European goods virtually disappeared, and not only that, but it's partly because the United States is going to start to impose tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. And so they did this because they want to produce their own stuff to keep Americans employed. And sometimes, again, you see this happening today. People have differing views on this, but generally speaking, if you isolate your economy in such a way, people are going to, if the whole world does bad, then it's going to affect everyone, even people within the United States. So generally speaking, these tariffs were not really a good thing during the Depression because it kind of exacerbated the problem. Conditions worse than the United States and other countries could not export to the U.S., which kind of set off this massive chain reaction where, like I said, everyone kind of just did even worse. And so world trade declined by 65%. That is huge. That would be catastrophic today. Countries depending on the United States for loans were hit very hard, and in particular, I'm talking about these ones that we're still trying to pick up the pieces from from World War One, Austria and Germany. And so they were hit hard because now all of a sudden the loans they were depending on for economic stability were not coming. So let's see what they did. Different groups did different things in response to the Depression. The British response. There was a multi-party coalition. And we're just talking about how there's going to be many parties in European parliaments. All right, not just two like there are in the United States Congress. And so they all had to get together and work together to figure out the best way that they could fix the economic woes that they were dealing with during the Depression. And over time, this worked. By 1937, productivity was up in factories, and the national government passed high tariffs. They increased taxes, they regulated currency, they lowered the interest rates, and they did all these things. You gotta be really careful with all these things. But again, the idea here is you want people to have money they can spend. But in doing so, these things actually did help them to stabilize their economy. By 1937, production was approximately what it was before. The French response, the more sufficient, less employed, they were more self-sufficient during this period, and there was less unemployment, so they didn't have to react maybe the same way as the British did. Political problems existed. There were 5 coalition governments in 1933, so that's a lot. That means that the government is changing a lot. They can't get along. There's also a strong anti-democratic political groups that begin to rise, and so this is kind of scary. But despite the problems here, France remained democratic. They didn't have it quite as bad as other Europeans in terms of the Great Depression. Now in Scandinavia, which is this region right here, okay. I'm sorry, I just kind of didn't circle Denmark. You can see Denmark down here at the bottom. All of this right here is going to be what we're looking at as the region of Scandinavia, and really usually you think about these. So sometimes you'll see these countries here, and you won't see as much maybe Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but sometimes maybe you will. So we'll leave them in there. And so what they did was they started to turn to socialism. Even today, you hear about these socialist countries here and how well off their economy is, and how their Human Development Index shows they're some of the best, most highly developed places in the world. Always, some of the highest standards of living in these areas. But we're not looking at socialism like what we generally think about it. What we're looking at is a form of democracy, but with socialist I guess a socialist process that's going to enable people to have more things more evenly distributed, but it's going to cost a lot more with things like taxes, for example. So what they did was they sponsored public works projects. They reduced unemployment. They increased unemployment insurance. There were subsidies for housing, which means that some people had their housing paid for, and they paid for this, like I said, with higher taxation. All right, but democracy remains. So these aren't like, we're not looking at the Soviet Union here. We're not looking at Cuba. We're looking at democracy, but with socialist tendencies, so that everyone kind of paid collectively through higher taxes. And this is one of the things that today you hear about people like Bernie Sanders or people like Elizabeth Warren. People look at them and they say, "Oh, these guys are socialists. Stay away." But what they're trying to do is build a system similar to what you would see here in Scandinavia. And again, just to kind of point this out, these systems result in higher taxes, but are communally invested in things like education, infrastructure, healthcare, and all these different things that today you hear as part of the political debacle or political debates. Today, these are some of the most highly developed countries in the world. So I just want to make that point right there. And then finally, the United States response to the Great Depression. And this right here is going to be through FDR's New Deal programs. It was centered on large public works, again, very similar kind of to maybe what we just talked about in Scandinavia. They were designed to provide jobs. So you have government agencies were provided funding. You've got public funding for welfare and relief programs to help people kind of pick themselves up. And then you got regulations that were imposed to reform banking and the stock market to kind of prevent the issues that led to the Great Depression from happening. But priority number one was to create jobs, recover the economy by increasing government spending, and hey, it worked. So all these countries experienced this Great Depression, and all of them also kind of saw their way out, but we are not in the clear. So going into the late 1930s, we're going to see another conflict like one that has never existed before. Get ready for World War II. I'll see you in the next video.